For the month of April, I ran a crafting challenge over on Discord to make a piece of terrain out of a Pringles can, and things got a little out of hand. So today I'll show you how I built the Psykers tower. Psykers are essentially the wizards of the science fiction universe of Warhammer 40,000, and every wizard needs a tower. First, we need to dispose of the contents. Creating a piece of terrain out of a Pringles can is somewhat of a rite of passage in terrain making because they're cheap, you can find them anywhere, and they're a fitting size for things like towers and silos in our wargames. There's a visible spiral that winds around the cylinder that's important to cover up because it breaks the illusions of a miniature building and makes it instantly recognizable as a cardboard tube. To do that, I'll cover it completely in a layer of thin cardboard. I'll cut up a bunch of little rectangles and glue them to the surface to make it look like the tower is made out of metal sheets. And then I cut out as many as I need. I marked them out because the rectangles aren't perfectly even, but each row should still be the same height. The card is a bit too rigid, so I'll need to bend it before I can glue the panels in place. So I rolled them around a glue stick to bend them into the shape that I need. And then I glue them to the Pringles tube using PVA glue, and I secure them in place with rubber bands. I proceed to make a bunch of H-beams out of chipboard like I've shown in detail in a previous video. I made the sides 5mm wide and the center 3mm. Interestingly, H-beams and I-beams are not the same thing. I-beams have narrower and tapered flanges and they are milled in one piece, whereas H-beams have wider flanges and are typically welded together out of 3 pieces. I use the beams as supports for a square platform and I make a square house to sit on top of the tower, but the square shape doesn't really look like something a wizard should live in. It looks more like a guard tower, so I'll put that aside for another project and I'll start over. This time round I'll make the house hexagonal instead, which seems more fitting and closer to the classic round wizard's tower. A hexagon is really just 6 equilateral triangles, meaning that all the sides are the same length and all the angles are 60 degrees. I measure out the angles, but I could just as well have used a compass to mark out the corners, which is easier and probably more accurate. I simply didn't think of it until I saw the footage later on. Now we have the base of the house ready, I'll make a platform for the minis to stand on so we can actually use it in-game. I wanted to make it wide enough for a 32mm base, but I made a mistake and measured the width from the corners, which are slightly wider than the sides. Meaning that in the end a 32mm base will have a slight overhang, which isn't really a problem except if I wanted to put railings on the platform. Then I cut out the 6 sides for the house and glued them in place using hot glue. Because the base is solid enough, I don't need to add another hexagon to the top. I'll just cover it with a roof later on. It simply wouldn't be a Warhammer 40,000 building without some Gothic arches. I'll start by making the trim for a couple of windows. To make the characteristic Gothic arch, you simply need to make 2 overlapping curves with a compass. To make the inner arch, you just reduce the radius and make 2 smaller curves, placing the compass needle in the same spot as for the outer arch. Then I carefully cut it out using a scalpel. Making the trim for the windows leaves us with a small shape that we can use as a template for making the holes in the house as well as decoration later on. Then I cut out the holes for the 2 windows I want and I glue all the Gothic arches in place. I think it's safe to assume that the people in the grimdark future like having some safety measures in their homes, so let's install a security mesh in the window frames. This mail organizer that time and technology has rendered completely useless has a nice mesh that I'll add to the window frames. The pattern looks like the leaded lattice window used in the late Middle Ages, so it seems fitting to me. To make a roof that fit the shape of the house and the wizard theme, I wanted to make a hexagonal spire roof. For that I use more of the thin cardboard. For making a hexagonal cone, once again you need 6 triangles, but with the inner angles being less than 60 degrees, so you will get a small triangular gap. I have absolutely no idea of how you calculate the pitch of a hexagonal roof, so I made a couple of quick paper sketches to find something that looked right. Once I have the shape that I want, I use a ruler to bend the sections. I should have left a small overlapping flap on one side so I could glue the ends together, but instead I use masking tape and hot glue, which works out fine since that side will be mostly hidden. Then I make a smaller version to sit on top of the first one, and I use tacky glue to stick them together. Incidentally, or perhaps not, it looks like a wizard's hat. Perhaps that's why wizard towers look the way they do. To give the tower a more ramshackle look, I'll add corrugated metal roofing, so I get some corrugated paper and I cut it into little sheets and remove the flat backing so they can overlap. Next I glue them to the roof, trimming them as needed. Once that is done, I glue some cardboard strips along the corners. I had this tube in my bits box, which at some point I cut at an angle, rotated and glued back together. I'll shorten it a bit so I can use it as a chimney pipe. For some added detail, I'll wrap a strip of cardboard around the top, making sure that the seam is on the side that will face the roof, so it won't be as noticeable. Then it's simply a matter of marking out where the chimney should go, cutting a hole and gluing it in place. To make the platform look a little more sturdy, I'll add some of the H-beams I made earlier around the bottom edge of the platform. Conveniently, I can use the lines I measured out earlier as a guide for cutting the H-beams at the correct angle. I'll also add some of the beams around the corners of the house to add to the industrial look. I'm kinda using the beams as substitutes where I think timber would have been in a medieval tower. With the house on top of it, the tower felt too tall, so I decided to trim off a section. Maybe I can use that for a well or a chemical vat or something in a future project. Sometimes it pays to be a hoarder. I want to break up the symmetry of the building, and I have this plastic thing from my box of possibilities that just happens to be half the height of the Pringles can after I shortened it. I'm gonna use it to support a bridge, so our psyker friend can go out in the crisp morning air and shout at people to go away. I'll use coffee stir sticks to make boards for the bridge. Last time I used them, one of you suggested that I could use a steel brush to texture a bunch of sticks at a time. I think previously I did them one at a time using a screwdriver. The steel brush was quite fast, but the effect wasn't as pronounced as I'd like. Next time I'll probably use both methods. Then I break them apart in roughly even lengths. I want them to look broken and uneven to add to the ramshackle vibe. I split a couple of them and break off bits and pieces. Once that's done, I make a black wash and throw the boards into the mix. I let them soak for a bit and then I take them out and slap on some green and brown paints for variation. And then I leave them to dry. I'll wait until I've painted the rest of the structure before gluing the boards in place so I don't accidentally get paint on them. Next I'll add an entryway to the tower. This is going to be a little box with a door and a slanted roof. Instead of making a box out of chipboard or foam board, I make a fitting shape out of XPS foam, which will make for a more solid structure. I use the block of XPS to trace the sides and the front onto a small piece of cardboard to make metal panels for the entryway. Then I cut them out and divide them into smaller panels, which I then glue in place. When using this kind of cereal box cardboard, the printed side should face outwards because it's a much smoother surface which will look better once you paint it. Once I added the side panels, I did the same thing for the front. The reason I didn't do them all in one go is that adding the side panels will make the front slightly wider. Of course, a flat box won't sit flush against a cylinder, So I use the bottom of the tower to mark out the proper curve, which I then remove with a hot wire tool. To make a roof for the entryway, I use more of the corrugated paper from earlier. Let's make some doors. I want the front door to have one of those mafia-style sliding peepholes you see in the movies. I tried a couple of different ways, and the easiest was to just make the top, bottom and sides separately and glue them to the door. The sides didn't line up perfectly, but it was easy enough to trim them with a scalpel later on. To make the door look more solid and menacing, I glue a couple of strips of cardboard across the door, much like the leaves of medieval hinges. I make 2 more doors in the same style, and I glue them in place with PVA glue. One for the entryway, one for the house on top of the tower, and one for the bridge that I'll make later on. Time to add some pipes. I measure out a piece of electrical conduit the same length as the tower, and I cut it with a craft saw on a piece of foam so I don't cut into my table. Then I glue it in place with tacky glue. Hot glue would be faster, but it's often more visible, so I tend to avoid using it in places where it will be visible. I'm using my table to line up the pipe with the tower. Paper straws make good pipes, but like the Pringles can, they have a spiral passing winding around them, but you can hide that by rolling a piece of masking tape around it. I think I learned that trick from Eric's Hobby Workshop, one of my favorite channels. Go check him out if you don't know him already. The tape will have a seam, so just remember to have that side facing the building. For some added detail, you can slice some little rings from a flexible tube of some kind. I have some plastic straws from years ago, but you could just use some strips of cardboard instead. Just cut the rings open on one side and you can clamp them on. Be sure to line up the opening with the seam from the masking tape. Add as many as you like, space them evenly, and fix them in place with a drop of super glue. Then I glue the pipes to the tower using tacky glue, and I repeat that a couple of times more with different pipes and tubes, like this corrugated one where I did use hot glue because the tube didn't want to stay put. Again, I'll be using H-beams as supports for the bridge. I cut the ends at an angle so they roughly match the curve of the tower. I glue them in place using hot glue because I think it'll hold better and it'll mostly be hidden. Then I glue the supports to the sides of the cylinder, and I make an end piece and glue that to the other pieces. I'll also add a couple of angled supports just because they look cool. Now that I know where the bridge is gonna be, I can glue the last door in place. I'll add a little strip of cardboard as flashing to cover up the small gap between the tower and the entryway. I make another little box the same way as the entryway and glue it to the tower, and I should probably install a pipe underneath it. I'll also add a bunch of tubes and pipes to the house on top of the tower. I cut the top parts of the pipes at an angle so they'll fit beneath the slanted roof. Let's add some wire and cables to the house. Gardening wire comes in different sizes and is inexpensive, but you can use any kind of wire you have lying around that isn't being used. Here I'm finally finding a use for a pair of cheap headphones that came with a phone that no one can remember buying. I used both tacky glue and hot glue. The roof will cover the upper part of the house so the hot glue won't be visible. And since I have the hot glue warmed up, I glue the wire mesh behind the 2 window frames. I'm cutting some short lengths of the headphone wires that I used earlier, and I'll use this for some added detail on the doors. I wanted to use styrene rod for this, but I didn't have a fitting size. However, the wire did actually work out quite well, as you'll see. I'll use the bits of wire for hinges for the doors and for handles. I really like how these details look. I made some T-beams as supports for the platform, and I cut the ends at a 45-degree angle. Then I glued them to the platform and the tower, one in each of the 6 corners of the platform. The platform is rigid enough on its own. Again, it's simply to add to the industrial look. The tip of the spire roof didn't look great, so I covered it in hot glue, which I could then sharpen into a point with my knife. Years ago I bought this sheet of half beads that I never got around to using, but it occurred to me that I could use them in this project. So I glued one above each of the doors and a couple more around the house, and I'm gonna paint them to look like lamps, hopefully. Of course, if we're going to make a tower for a psyker, we are going to need a psyker for the tower. To make the psyker, I mostly used bits from the Celestial Hurricanum, which has a lot of nice parts. It was fairly simple to make. I simply took an arm from one model and glued it onto another model, and I also swapped out the head to one from the Empire Flagellants kit. I did record how I painted him, but I wasn't satisfied with the result, so I ended up repainting most of the miniature. I primed the tower with a cheap brown spray paint that I thought might work as a rust color, but it looked a little too purple for my liking. I wanted to make hazard stripes on the platform, so I started by painting it white, which gave me a good base color for painting it yellow. Yellow is typically highly transparent, so I found that painting it over white makes your life a lot easier. Then I painted the tower in a bone color. From past experience, I gave the platform a thick coat of varnish using a rattle can and let it dry completely before sticking on the masking tape, and then I sprayed it black. Now what I should have done was to give it another coat of yellow to fill in small gaps underneath the masking tape, but I forgot, and this is the result. I thought I'd try to remove the excess paint with a makeup sponge and some alcohol, and luckily that worked out. If I hadn't applied that layer of varnish, the alcohol would probably have stripped off both the yellow and the white layers too. I tend to paint my terrain in flat, drab colors, which can get a little boring to look at, so I thought I'd challenge myself to use some bright colors instead and try to make some gradients. So I painted the house light blue, as well as the entryway and the little box on the side of the tower. Then I painted the lower halves a darker shade of blue. I gave the roof a base color of light gray. I find it's easier to do weathering on light colors, which you'll see in a moment. The doors I painted yellow the same way as I did with the platform, starting with a white base coat and then a yellow layer over that. I used a yellow contrast paint to shade the lower halves of the doors. All the pipes I painted brown. You'll often see a combination of white and blue on wizards' towers, as well as brown timber, so I tried to replicate that paint scheme here. Then I painted the details on the house using a bone color for the Gothic arches and a couple of random colors for the wires. Alright, it's time to do some weathering. I'll start by stippling on some colors with a sponge. I find it's a lot easier to control if you use one of these alligator clips to hold the sponge. I stipple on a couple of different shades of brown all over the roof, focusing on the lower parts of each panel. At this point you couldn't tell at a glance that the roof was made out of different sheets of metal, so I added some extra rust along the edges of each panel to separate them. Then I stippled some paint chipping on the rest of the tower, using the same technique as on the roof. I also made some larger paint chips using a paintbrush. And like on the roof, I stippled along the edges of all the panels to make them look like they were chipped. Next I'll make an oil wash by mixing brown and black oil paints with white spirits. Then I apply it to the entire building to bring everything together and to tone down some of the brightness of the colors, as well as making the building look more old and worn. The oil wash made the whole thing look more dirty than I wanted, but the cool thing about oil washes is that they take a long time to dry, so you can clean some of it off if you don't like the effect. To add to the rust effect on the roof, I used some pigment powders, which give a dry, dusty look. I did the same thing for the other roofs and for the pipes. The oil wash is completely dry. Now let's add some rust streaks. I have a couple of oil paints that I haven't tried before, so I wanted to test all 3 for this project. It turned out that the burnt sienna from Winsor Newton had the best effect, so I used that for all the rust streaks. When working with oil paints, you want to use synthetic brushes. In this instance, I use 3 brushes. The first one I use to place a dot of paint where I want the streaks to begin. I use a second, bigger brush to drag the paint downwards to create the streaks. And I dip the third one in white spirit to adjust or remove the oil paint. As always, I'd like to thank my patrons for making these videos possible, and a special thanks to Mr. Alf, who recently joined us. Now we can finally add the boards to the bridge. The wood is looking a little dull, so I'll adjust the color. I start by covering the boards with water. The water will make sure that I get a smooth transition. Then I add some Agrax Earthshade and some Nuln Oil to the sides of the boards. I want to see if I can do an OSL effect on the lamps. I start by painting them white with a brush, then I spray a thin layer of white ink around the lamp. And finally I add a layer of yellow contrast paint. And now it's time for the final result. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.